Picture a mansion so large and elegant that it seemed almost unreal. A place where wealth was not just displayed, but carved into stone, marble, and art. This was Lynnewood Hall, a 110-room palace built in 1897 in Elkins Park, just outside Philadelphia. At the height of the Gilded Age, when American industrialists were richer than many European kings, Lynnewood Hall stood as one of the greatest private homes ever constructed in the United States. It was designed to rival the palaces of Europe, especially Versailles, and in many ways, it succeeded. The man behind this extraordinary estate was Peter A.B. Widener, a self-made billionaire whose life followed the classic Gilded Age path, from poverty to unimaginable wealth. Born in 1834 to a poor working-class family, Widener left school at just 13 years old to help support his parents. His father was a bricklayer, his mother took in sewing, and money was always scarce. But Peter Widener was sharp, observant, and deeply driven. He started as a butcher's assistant, saved every dollar he could, and by his late teens, he owned his own small butcher shop. During the Civil War, he secured contracts to supply meat to Union troops, a tough and unglamorous business, but one that made him his first real fortune. After the war, Widener saw opportunity where others did not. As American cities grew, people needed transportation, and Widener realized that whoever controlled streetcars controlled the city itself. He began buying and consolidating horse-drawn streetcar lines in Philadelphia, then upgraded them when electric streetcars became possible. Through aggressive tactics, political influence, and smart timing, Widener built a transportation empire that stretched beyond Philadelphia to cities like Chicago, New York, and Baltimore. By the 1890s, he was one of the richest men in America, worth tens of millions of dollars at a time when most workers earned only a few $100s a year. With his fortune secured, Widener turned his attention to something deeply personal: art and culture. Unlike many tycoons who collected art simply to impress, Widener studied it seriously. He traveled to Europe, visited museums, learned from experts, and developed a refined taste for old master paintings and Renaissance works. When he decided to build Lynnewood Hall, it was not just to show off his wealth, but to create a permanent home for his art collection and his family legacy. He hired a young architect named Horace Trumbauer, who was only 27 years old at the time. Trumbauer had no formal architectural education, but possessed extraordinary talent and ambition. Together, Widener and Trumbauer created a palace unlike anything America had seen. Lynnewood Hall covered more than 70,000 square feet, with ceilings over 20 feet high, walls covered in silk imported from France, and floors made of rare Italian marble. The grand staircase alone was carved from a single massive block of marble, and rose 3 stories high. The house contained 62 bathrooms with hot and cold running water, an indoor swimming pool, elevators, a bowling alley, a private theater, and its own electric power system, all in 1897. Outside, formal gardens, fountains, sculptures, and carriage houses completed the vision of European royalty transplanted to Pennsylvania. But the true treasure of Lynnewood Hall hung quietly on its walls. Widener filled the house with masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Raphael, Donatello, and many others. These were not copies, but originals, works so valuable that some rooms held more artistic worth than entire museums. The centerpiece was Rembrandt's painting, The Mill, which Widener purchased in 1911 for a record-breaking price. By the time Lynnewood Hall was complete, Peter Widener stood at the absolute peak of success. He had risen from poverty, built an empire, created a palace, assembled one of the finest art collections in the world, and surrounded himself with family. To him, everything seemed permanent, secure, and untouchable. He believed Lynnewood Hall would remain in the Widener family for generations, a lasting symbol of American success. He could not have known, that within 15 years, tragedy would begin to tear that dream apart. By the early 20th century, the Widener family lived a life that few Americans could even imagine. Lynnewood Hall required dozens of servants to operate smoothly, and luxury surrounded the family at every moment. Breakfasts were served on fine china, worth more than a worker's monthly wage. Afternoons were spent walking through art galleries or reading in libraries lined with rare books. Evenings brought lavish dinners for dozens of guests, attended by business leaders, politicians, and cultural figures. Peter Widener's sons, George and Joseph, were successful businessmen in their own right, and his grandchildren were raised in privilege and comfort. George Widener, the elder son, was particularly close to his father. He shared Peter's love for art and culture and expanded the family's collecting interests. George's son, Harry Widener, was especially gifted. Harvard-educated, thoughtful, and deeply passionate about books, Harry began assembling an extraordinary collection of rare volumes while still in his 20s. He dreamed of donating his library to Harvard someday, creating a lasting academic legacy for the Widener name. By 1912, the family seemed secure beyond question. That spring, George Widener decided to take his wife Eleanor and their son Harry on a European trip. It was a routine decision for a family used to crossing the Atlantic in first class. They planned to visit art dealers, booksellers, and enjoy the cultural life of Europe. When it came time to return to America, they booked passage aboard the newest and most luxurious ship in the world, the RMS Titanic. The Titanic promised unmatched comfort, safety, and elegance. Its first-class cabins rivaled the finest hotels, and its passengers included many of the wealthiest people in the world. For the Widener family, the voyage felt like just another pleasant journey home. On board, George and Harry spent time discussing books and art, while Eleanor enjoyed the social life of first-class dining rooms and lounges. On the night of April 14, 1912, the family attended an elegant dinner, laughing and making plans for the future. Harry excused himself early, carrying a newly purchased rare book to his cabin, while his parents stayed behind, enjoying conversation and wine. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck an iceberg. What followed is one of the most famous disasters in history. But for the Widener family, it was a deeply personal catastrophe. As the ship began to sink, chaos spread slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. Lifeboats were lowered, but there were not enough for everyone. George and Eleanor made a heartbreaking decision. They put Eleanor into a lifeboat, but refused to abandon their son. Harry chose to stay with his father. When Eleanor realized what was happening, she refused to leave without them. In the end, George, Eleanor, and Harry Widener all went down with the ship. Their bodies were never recovered. When news reached Peter Widener in Philadelphia, the shock was devastating. In a single night, he lost his beloved son, his daughter-in-law, and his promising grandson. No amount of money, power, or influence could change what had happened. The tragedy shattered the Widener family, emotionally and spiritually. Peter withdrew from public life, his grief deep and lasting. Lynnewood Hall, once full of laughter and activity, grew quieter. The art remained on the walls, the rooms unchanged, but something essential had been lost. The future Peter Widener had imagined for his family vanished beneath the cold waters of the Atlantic. Though he lived a few more years, he was never the same. The dynasty he had built now rested on fragile ground, and the palace meant to symbolize permanence had become a silent reminder of unbearable loss. After the Titanic disaster, Lynnewood Hall slowly began its long decline. Peter Widener died in 1915, leaving behind an estate still vast, but deeply altered by tragedy. Much of the art collection was eventually donated to museums, including the National Gallery of Art in Washington, fulfilling part of Harry Widener's dream, as Harvard used his collection to establish the Widener Library. While these donations preserved the art, they drained Lynnewood Hall of its purpose. Without the family and the treasures that gave it meaning, the mansion became an empty shell. Over the following decades, the Widener heirs struggled to maintain the enormous property. The costs of upkeep were enormous, and changing economic conditions made such estates increasingly impractical. By the mid-20th century, Lynnewood Hall was sold and repurposed several times, serving briefly as a school and later as a seminary. None of these uses could truly support the scale of the building. Gradually, neglect set in. Roofs began to leak, heating systems failed, and maintenance slowed. By the 1950s, the house was largely abandoned. Without constant care, even the finest materials deteriorate. Water seeped into ceilings, freezing and cracking plaster. Windows shattered, allowing rain, wind, and animals inside. Vandals broke in, spray painting graffiti across marble walls and ornate columns. Floors collapsed, staircases crumbled, and priceless craftsmanship was destroyed. What had been built to last forever was now falling apart. For decades, Lynnewood Hall stood behind rusting gates, hidden by overgrown trees, a ghost of the Gilded Age slowly returning to nature. Urban explorers and photographers documented its decay, spreading images of its haunting interiors across the internet. These images shocked many Americans who had never heard of the mansion before. How could something so magnificent be allowed to rot? The answer lies in a combination of tragedy, changing values, and time. The Gilded Age belief in permanence was an illusion. Wealth could build palaces, but it could not guarantee continuity. As America moved through wars, economic depressions, and social change, estates like Lynnewood Hall no longer fit the modern world. In recent years, there have been renewed efforts to restore Lynnewood Hall. Preservationists and developers have proposed ambitious plans to save the structure, stabilize its foundations, and return it to life in some form. These efforts face enormous challenges, including funding, legal issues, and the sheer scale of restoration required. Still, the mansion remains standing, battered but not yet lost. Today, Lynnewood Hall stands as a powerful symbol of both human ambition and human fragility. It tells a story not just about wealth, but about impermanence, about how quickly fortunes rise and fall, about how even the grandest dreams can be undone by a single night. The Widener family built a palace to rival Versailles, believing it would last for generations. Instead, it became a monument to loss, grief, and the passing of an era. As sunlight filters through broken windows and vines creep across limestone walls, Lynnewood Hall reminds us that history is not just found in textbooks or museums. Sometimes it stands abandoned, crumbling quietly, waiting for us to remember what once was, and to reflect on how fragile even the greatest achievements truly are. By the time the 21st century arrived, Lynnewood Hall had become something very different from what Peter A.B. Widener once imagined. What was built as a permanent symbol of success had turned into a warning frozen in stone. The mansion still stood, massive and imposing, but its beauty was broken. Trees pushed through cracked terraces. Rainwater pooled on marble floors once polished daily by servants. Paintings that once hung beneath perfect light were long gone, replaced by empty frames of dust and shadow. And yet, despite its decay, Lynnewood Hall refused to disappear. That refusal is part of what makes its story so powerful. Many Gilded Age mansions were demolished, erased entirely to make room for modern buildings. Lynnewood Hall survived not because it was protected, but because it was too large, too expensive, and too complicated to destroy. In a strange way, its neglect preserved it. The house became a physical memory of an era when Americans believed wealth could defeat time itself. As historians, architects, and preservationists began paying closer attention, Lynnewood Hall slowly gained a new identity. It was no longer just a ruined mansion. It became a symbol of the Gilded Age's greatest illusion, the belief that money could make anything permanent. Visitors who managed to see the interior described a strange emotional experience. Walking through the vast halls, surrounded by collapse and silence, it was impossible not to imagine the echoes of music, conversation, and laughter that once filled the space. The contrast between past and present was overwhelming. This emotional power is why Lynnewood Hall continues to fascinate people today. It is not just the size or the luxury that captures attention, but the story behind it. A story of ambition, brilliance, pride, and loss. A story that feels deeply human despite the extraordinary wealth involved. In recent years, serious efforts have been made to save Lynnewood Hall from complete destruction. New owners announced plans to stabilize the structure, repair the roof, and eventually restore the mansion. These efforts are complex and controversial. Restoring a house of this size requires hundreds of millions of dollars, specialized craftsmen, and years of work. Some critics question whether such an effort is worth it, arguing that the money could be used elsewhere. Others believe that saving Lynnewood Hall is about more than preserving a building. It is about preserving a story that cannot be told anywhere else. Unlike museums, which display objects behind glass, Lynnewood Hall itself is the artifact. Its cracked walls, collapsed ceilings, and surviving details tell a story more powerful than any plaque or exhibit. Even in ruin, the craftsmanship is astonishing. Hand-carved stonework still shows perfect symmetry. Marble columns remain upright despite decades of neglect. Decorative ceilings reveal glimpses of their former beauty beneath peeling layers. These details remind us that this was not careless excess. It was skill, labor, and vision brought together at the highest level. Hundreds of workers, many of them immigrants, devoted years of their lives to building this palace. Their work outlived the family who commissioned it. That fact alone challenges the idea that Lynnewood Hall was only about wealth. It was also about human effort, creativity, and ambition. The story of the Widener family, when viewed through the lens of time, feels less like a tale of greed and more like a tragedy shaped by confidence and belief. Peter Widener did not think of himself as temporary. Like many men of his era, he believed progress moved in one direction, upward and forward. He believed his children and grandchildren would naturally inherit his success. The Titanic shattered that belief in the most brutal way possible. After that night, Lynnewood Hall lost its future. Without George, without Harry, the chain of inheritance was broken. The palace became a place of memory rather than hope. This shift is crucial to understanding why Lynnewood Hall declined so quickly. Buildings do not decay only because of weather or neglect. They decay when they lose meaning. Once the family stopped seeing Lynnewood as a living home, it became impossible to justify the enormous effort required to maintain it. Over time, society itself changed. The Gilded Age ended. Public opinion turned against extreme displays of wealth. Taxes increased. Large private estates became symbols of inequality rather than success. The world that had produced Lynnewood Hall no longer existed. And yet, despite all of this, Lynnewood Hall still speaks to modern audiences. In an age of fast wealth, digital empires, and rapid change, the story feels surprisingly relevant. It reminds us that success can vanish quickly, that plans for the future can be undone in a moment, that permanence is often an illusion we tell ourselves to feel safe. For many people today, Lynnewood Hall represents a cautionary tale. Not a warning against ambition, but a warning against believing that ambition alone is enough. The mansion stands as proof that legacy requires more than money. It requires continuity, care, and time. Whether Lynnewood Hall will be fully restored remains uncertain. What is certain is that its story will continue to be told. Through documentaries, photographs, books, and quiet curiosity, people keep returning to this fallen palace. They are not drawn only by decay, but by the human drama behind it. A butcher's son who built an empire, a family that seemed untouchable, a ship that changed everything, and a palace that outlived the dream it was meant to protect. Today, as sunlight filters through broken windows and dust drifts across marble floors, Lynnewood Hall stands somewhere between ruin and survival. It is no longer America's Versailles, but in many ways, it is something more honest. It is a reminder that history is fragile, that greatness is temporary, and that even the strongest foundations cannot protect us from loss. And perhaps that is why Lynnewood Hall still matters. Not because it shows us how powerful America once was, but because it shows us how human we have always been. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic moved quietly through the North Atlantic, its massive engines humming beneath layers of steel, its decks glowing with electric light. Inside, first-class passengers finished long dinners, laughed softly, and believed completely in the promise that surrounded them. This ship was not supposed to fail. Newspapers had called it unsinkable. Engineers said it was the safest vessel ever built. For the richest families in America, Titanic was not a risk, but a guarantee. Among them were George Widener, his wife Eleanor, and their son Harry. They were not tourists chasing excitement. They were members of America's elite, traveling in comfort, protected by wealth, reputation, and the belief that nothing truly bad could happen to people like them. When the ship struck the iceberg, it did not feel dramatic. There was no explosion, just a shudder, a strange sound, like something heavy being dragged across stone. Someone asked what it was. Someone else laughed. The party continued. Glasses were refilled. Conversations resumed. The idea of danger felt almost insulting. Titanic was too big, too modern, too advanced to fail. But within minutes, that confidence began to crack. A steward appeared, calm but serious, asking passengers to put on life jackets and go on deck. He said it was only a precaution, probably nothing, but his eyes said otherwise. George and Eleanor looked at each other. Something was wrong. The ship felt solid, steady, almost like a building. But fear does not always come from movement. Sometimes it comes from silence and from the expressions on other people's faces. They went back to their suite to put on warmer clothes. They still believed this would pass, that they would laugh about it later. But when they returned to the deck, the illusion was gone. The cold air carried confusion. The crew moved with forced calm. Lifeboats were being uncovered. Orders were being given. The band began to play music, not to entertain, but to keep people from panicking. Eleanor stood in her evening dress with a fur coat thrown over it, trying to understand what was happening. George put his arm around her. Harry stood close, holding the rare book he had bought in Europe, a treasure he was proud of. They were first-class passengers. Surely they would be safe. Surely there was a plan. But Titanic did not have enough lifeboats. It carried more than 2,200 people and had space for barely half. Someone had decided that too many lifeboats would ruin the look of the ship. Beauty had been chosen over safety, wealth over reality. An officer approached Eleanor and told her she needed to get into a lifeboat. George understood immediately. Women and children first. It was not a suggestion. It was a rule. Eleanor resisted. She did not want to leave her husband and son. Harry was 27, too old to be considered a child. George was a grown man. Neither would be allowed into the boat while women remained on board. Eleanor said she would not go without them. George's voice became firm. He told her to go. Their other children were waiting at home. They needed their mother. Time was running out. Harry tried to give Eleanor his book, asking her to keep it safe. She refused. She believed he would survive. She believed they all would. George lifted her into the boat himself. He told her he loved her. He said he would see her soon. The boat began to lower. Eleanor looked up and saw her husband and son standing together at the rail, smiling for her, pretending everything was fine. It was the last time she would ever see them. As the lifeboat moved away, Titanic's deck grew steeper. More boats were launched half-empty because people still did not believe the ship would sink. Men smoked cigars, some drank brandy. Others helped women into boats and stepped back, accepting their fate with quiet dignity. George and Harry stayed together. They followed the code of their world, the belief that privilege came with responsibility. Around 2:20 in the morning, Titanic broke apart. The lights went out. The stern rose high into the air, pointing at the stars, and then fell back into the ocean. The water was freezing, so cold that death came quickly. George Widener and his son Harry died that night, along with more than 1,500 others. Eleanor watched from a lifeboat as the screams faded and the ocean went silent. The boats did not return. When rescue finally came, she was alive, but everything else was gone. 3 weeks later, Eleanor Widener returned to America alone. The newspapers already knew the story. Everyone knew. But knowing something and facing it are very different things. When the train arrived in Philadelphia, her surviving children stood waiting. They already understood what had happened, but seeing their mother step off the train without their father and brother made the loss real in a way words never could. From the station, they drove toward Lynnewood Hall, the Widener family estate. The long road through Elkins Park was lined with trees, just beginning to bloom in the spring sunlight. Then the house appeared, massive and unchanged, 110 rooms, limestone walls glowing softly. Perfect gardens. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. Lynnewood Hall had been built as a monument to success. George's father, Peter Widener, had created it as a place where art, culture, and family would live together for generations. Inside were priceless paintings, rare books, and rooms designed not just to impress, but to last forever. Now it felt like a tomb. Peter Widener met Eleanor at the door. In just 3 weeks, he looked years older. He had lost his son and his grandson, his future and his legacy, in a single night. Inside, the servants had prepared everything perfectly. Eleanor's rooms were ready. Tea was waiting. Flowers were fresh. They were trying to preserve normal life, but normal life no longer existed. Eleanor walked through the house slowly, like a ghost. Every room held memories. The library where Harry used to read. The dining room where George would sit at the head of the table. The art gallery where the family once stood together, discussing paintings. Now she stood alone. Silence filled the house, heavy and uncomfortable. No one knew what to say. Peter Widener tried to bury himself in work, but the meaning was gone. He had built an empire for his children. Now most of them were dead. Eleanor tried to keep routines for her remaining children, but the house was too large, too empty. The table that once seated dozens now served only a few. Grief echoed through every hallway. Months passed. Legal matters filled their days. Wills, estates, business decisions. Eventually, Eleanor made a choice. Harry had dreamed of creating a great library. She decided to build it in his name. The Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library at Harvard would become a place of learning for generations. It gave her a purpose, but it did not heal the loss. Peter Widener's health declined. In 1915, he died, broken by grief. With his death, Lynnewood Hall lost its reason for existing. The family no longer gathered there. The art remained, but the life was gone. Over time, the Widener collection began to scatter. Paintings were donated or sold. The house became quieter, emptier. Eleanor eventually remarried and moved away. Lynnewood was no longer a home. It became a responsibility. The world outside changed quickly. World War I, new taxes, fewer servants, and changing values made houses like Lynnewood impossible to maintain. By the 1930s, the mansion felt outdated, excessive, even embarrassing during the Great Depression. Joseph Widener, the last surviving son, tried to hold on, but the cost was enormous. Eventually, the most important art was donated to museums, including the National Gallery of Art. Without the art, Lynnewood lost its purpose entirely. It became an empty shell, too big, too expensive, and too painful to use. Slowly, the house began to die. By the mid-20th century, Lynnewood Hall was no longer truly alive. It was legally owned, but emotionally abandoned. Staff was reduced. Repairs were delayed, then ignored. Nature does not wait. Water found its way inside. Roofs began to fail. Windows broke and were never replaced. Once the house was empty, vandals discovered it. Graffiti covered walls, once lined with silk. Marble staircases were chipped and broken. Ornate plaster ceilings collapsed under years of water damage. What had taken craftsmen months to build was destroyed in minutes. Preservation groups tried to help. They warned that the house was historically important, that it was an architectural masterpiece. But restoration would cost tens of millions of dollars. No one wanted to take responsibility. The family could not afford to save it. Developers saw no profit. Governments did not want the burden. So Lynnewood Hall remained trapped. Too important to destroy, too damaged to save. Decade by decade, it collapsed. Photographers and urban explorers documented its decay. Once a symbol of success, it became a symbol of failure. Broken windows stared like empty eyes. Trees grew wild. Rain poured through holes in the roof, destroying everything below. In 2024, walking through Lynnewood Hall feels like walking through a corpse. The grand entrance hall is cracked and stained. The ballroom floor has collapsed. The library is empty, its shelves rotting, its books long gone. The gardens are jungles, fountains are broken, sculptures are missing, and yet the structure still stands, stubbornly refusing to disappear. People argue about whether it should be saved. Some say it represents important history and craftsmanship that can never be replaced. Others say the money could be better spent elsewhere. There is no clear answer. Lynnewood Hall is America's forgotten Versailles, not because people do not know about it, but because it makes us uncomfortable. It reminds us that wealth does not last, that power fades, that even the greatest dreams can collapse. Titanic killed George and Harry in one night. Lynnewood Hall died slowly, over a century, while everyone watched. And that slow death may be the most tragic part of all. As the years passed and Lynnewood Hall continued to decay, the house stopped being just a forgotten mansion and became something else entirely. It became a question, a problem no one knew how to solve. Neighbors looked at it with frustration and fear. Preservationists looked at it with sadness and urgency. Historians saw it as a rare and irreplaceable example of America's Gilded Age ambition. Developers saw a financial nightmare. The Widener family, still tied to the house through layers of trusts and legal agreements, saw something heavy and complicated. A responsibility passed down through generations that no one had ever wanted, but no one knew how to escape. Every option seemed wrong. Restoring Lynnewood Hall would cost an enormous amount of money. Estimates climbed higher every year. $50 million, then 70, then $100 million. And even that might not be enough. The damage was not cosmetic. It was structural. Roofs had collapsed. Floors were unsafe. Walls were soaked with decades of water damage. Mold crept into everything. The plumbing, electrical systems, and heating were long dead. To restore the house would mean tearing out nearly everything inside and rebuilding it piece by piece while trying to preserve what little historic material remained. It would be less like restoration and more like resurrection. But resurrection requires belief, and belief was in short supply. Lynnewood Hall was not located in a tourist destination. It sat quietly in a Philadelphia suburb, surrounded by ordinary homes. There were no mountains, no vineyards, no grand landscapes like Biltmore Estate. There was no clear way to turn it into a profitable attraction. You could not easily make it a hotel. You could not turn it into apartments without destroying what made it historically important. A museum might work, but museums need steady visitors and steady funding, and Lynnewood did not offer either. For decades, meetings were held, reports were written, ideas were proposed. Nothing moved forward. The house remained frozen in time, slowly falling apart. In the 1990s and early 2000s, urban explorers began breaking in more frequently. They filmed videos, took photographs, and shared them online. Millions of people around the world saw Lynnewood Hall for the first time, not as it once was, but as a ruin. The images were shocking. Grand staircases covered in graffiti, ceilings collapsed into piles of plaster and wood. Sunlight pouring through holes in the roof, lighting rooms that had once been softly illuminated by chandeliers. These images brought attention, but not salvation. Attention alone does not fix a roof. It does not stop rain. It does not pay craftsmen. In 2012, exactly 100 years after Titanic sank, historians and preservationists gathered to discuss Lynnewood's future. They walked through the building carefully, because parts of it were dangerous. Floors could give way. Walls could fall. Their conclusion was painful but honest. Lynnewood Hall was not impossible to save, but it was practically unsavable. It would take a billionaire with deep pockets, endless patience, and no expectation of financial return. That kind of person is rare, and even if such a person existed, they would likely choose a project with fewer problems and a better location. So the house waited. Weather continued its work. Vandals continued theirs. And time, the most powerful force of all, continued quietly and without mercy. Then, in the early 2020s, something unexpected happened. A wealthy buyer stepped forward. A billionaire named Richard Yun purchased Lynnewood Hall. For the first time in decades, there was real hope. Yun announced plans to restore the mansion as part of a larger mixed-use development. The house would be saved. It would become a museum and event space. New buildings would be added nearby to make the project financially possible. Preservationists reacted with cautious optimism. They had heard promises before. They knew how quickly enthusiasm could fade once real costs became clear. Still, this was more than Lynnewood had seen in generations. For the first time, someone with resources and interest had taken ownership. But hope does not erase reality. The challenges were enormous. Before anything else, the building had to be stabilized. Roofs repaired, walls reinforced, windows replaced, water stopped. Then came the interior. Every system had to be rebuilt from scratch. Electricity, plumbing, heating and cooling, fire safety, accessibility. Modern codes did not exist when Lynnewood was built. Bringing it into the modern world without destroying its historic character would be incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive. And even if restoration succeeded, a deeper question remained. What would Lynnewood Hall become? It could never again be what Peter Widener intended. It would never be a private family home filled with children, art, and dinner parties. That world was gone forever. Any future version of Lynnewood would be commercial in some way. A venue, a museum, a space rented out to justify its cost. Practical, yes. Necessary, yes. But also an admission that the original dream had failed completely. This leads to a larger and more uncomfortable question. Should Lynnewood Hall be saved at all? Preservationists argue that it represents craftsmanship and artistry that modern society can no longer easily reproduce. That allowing it to collapse is like tearing pages out of history. Pragmatists argue that resources are limited. That spending $100 million on a single ruined mansion means not saving dozens of smaller historic buildings that are easier to restore and serve more people. Both sides have valid points. There is no perfect answer. Lynnewood Hall forces us to confront something uncomfortable about American history. It reminds us of extreme wealth, extreme inequality, and the belief that money could protect against fate. It shows how quickly success can turn into tragedy. Peter Widener was not a villain. He was a self-made man who loved art and culture. He built something beautiful with genuine passion. And then, through random chance, he lost the people who mattered most to him. The house outlived its purpose. It became a monument not to success, but to loss. Lynnewood Hall is called America's forgotten Versailles, not because it is unknown, but because it represents a part of history we do not know how to feel about. It is too recent to feel romantic, too grand to ignore, too broken to easily fix. Standing outside its rusted gates today, you are not just looking at a ruined building. You are looking at the physical remains of a dream that could not survive reality. Titanic destroyed the Widener family in one terrible night. Lynnewood Hall carried that destruction forward slowly, year after year, room by room. Some ruins tell stories of ancient empires long gone. Lynnewood tells a modern story, a story of ambition, tragedy, guilt, and decay. A reminder that nothing is permanent, not ships, not fortunes, not palaces, and that sometimes the most tragic endings are not sudden or dramatic, but slow, quiet, and unfolding right in front of us while we argue about what should be done, until one day there is nothing left to save. In the end, the story of the Onassis family is not just the story of wealth, ships, and power, but a reminder of how fragile human life truly is. Aristotle Onassis achieved what millions of people only dream of. He rose from nothing, crossed oceans with ambition, and built an empire that reshaped global shipping forever. His name became a symbol of success, influence, and luxury. He dined with kings, married the most famous woman in the world, and owned islands, yachts, and palaces. From the outside, his life looked perfect. But behind the glitter and headlines, the Onassis family lived under a shadow that money could never remove. Each success came with a quiet cost, and each generation seemed to carry a heavier emotional burden than the last. The greatest tragedy was that Aristotle Onassis, a man who controlled fleets and fortunes, could not protect the people he loved most. The death of his son Alexander broke him in a way nothing else ever did. Alexander was not just his heir, he was his hope, his future, and the reason he believed his empire would live on. When Alexander died so young, the heart of the Onassis dynasty died with him. From that moment, Aristotle was no longer chasing success. He was chasing meaning, comfort, and peace, but none of them ever truly came. His health declined, his spirit weakened, and the empire he built began to feel empty without someone to inherit it with passion. Christina Onassis, left to carry the family name, lived a life surrounded by luxury but starved of emotional stability. She had everything except what mattered most: love without conditions and peace without loneliness. Her multiple marriages, struggles with trust, and constant pressure to live up to her father's legacy slowly drained her. The world saw her as a rich heiress, but few understood the weight she carried. Her death shocked the public, yet for those who looked closely, it felt like the final chapter of a story already filled with loss. With Christina gone, the Onassis Empire was no longer a family dynasty. It became a memory. Today, only fragments of the once mighty Onassis world remain. The ships still sail under different owners. The famous island exists, but without the laughter and life it once held. The name Onassis is remembered, studied, and admired, but it no longer represents a living legacy. Instead, it stands as a symbol of a powerful truth. Success without emotional balance can lead to isolation, and wealth without purpose can leave behind silence instead of happiness. The Onassis story teaches us that money can buy comfort, but it cannot buy time, health, or protection from fate. It reminds us that families, not fortunes, are what truly last. Empires rise and fall, names fade, and headlines disappear, but human pain and love remain deeply real. Aristotle Onassis conquered the seas, but life conquered him. His family's tragic fate proves that no amount of power can shield a person from loss, and no empire is stronger than the bonds that hold a family together. As we look back at the rise and fall of the Onassis family, we are left with more than a history lesson. We are left with a warning and a reflection. A warning that success should never come at the cost of human connection, and a reflection that true wealth is not measured in ships or money, but in peace, love, and legacy passed through generations. The Onassis name may live on in books and documentaries, but their story will forever remind us that even the richest dynasties can meet the most heartbreaking endings.